Scripture reading will be Exodus 17, 6 through 7. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and the water will come out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So he called the name of the place Massah Meribah because of the contention of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not?
You have your Bibles and would like to turn to Exodus 17, focus our attention there for just a few minutes. I love studying the Scriptures for a lot of reasons. I love that I get to do it every day for a lot of reasons. I love it for personal gain, but I also love it because then I get to share some of those things with you, and it just is a joy to do that. But I think also it makes me appreciate God so much more every time I get to do that. When you dive into the Scriptures and you see connections between Old Testament events and passages and people with New Testament events, passages, and people, and it just makes you appreciate so much the wisdom and the thought, the foreknowledge of God to seamlessly connect those things throughout all of the years and all of the people and all of the events that tried to keep that from happening, how He still seamlessly connected them without any contradiction or any problem. I love that, and it excites me when I make those connections and see those things. And this particular thought, coupled with another, which I'll introduce in a second, is a result of one of those studies. Now, the other part of it is everything that's happened over the last week or so, or maybe 2 weeks, over on the eastern part of our country, the hurricane. And you look at places that have been affected. I was actually seeing a map of the interstate over in the Asheville area saying that it's supposed to be closed until the end of 2025. Like, it blows my mind that there was so much damage done. And it doesn't even, to me, seem like geographically the hurricane even went anywhere near it, but it was affected. It was completely damaged. I mean, I've seen videos where houses, literal full brick houses, were floating down the road in the water. Caskets were floating by as people videoed. Like, it's tragedy. You know, and you think about all of the hundreds of thousands of people that are lost, that they can't find, that there's so many people that have died as a result of this. And you look at events like that, and there's this message that permeates social media, that permeates news outlets, or maybe not so much news outlets anymore as it once was, but you do see it occasionally where the encouragement is, or the reminder is, hey, trust God. Everything's going to be fine. Trust God. God can take something like this tragedy, this disaster, and He can do something great with it. Trust God in moments like this. And in the wake of a disaster, in the wake of tragedy, in the wake of difficult things, the question usually always comes up at some point. And I thought maybe that's why it would be good for us to revisit this, because it doesn't really matter how often this happens. In fact, they're tracking another hurricane headed straight for Florida right now. That's going to happen soon, okay? And it will happen. This question will be asked in just a couple of weeks, just like it was last week. And if it happens again 2 days later, somebody else is going to ask the question. And it usually is this: how could God let that happen? I mean, how could God let that happen? And maybe there's other questions I guess you could follow it up with, and maybe there are theological questions or emotional questions. I mean, those kind of revolve around the idea. How could God allow it? The emotional side of things is, well, how do I deal with it since it did happen? How's my life supposed to move forward? What am I supposed to do in the wake of tragedy? I'm not just talking about natural disaster now, but I'm talking about all of these things that happen in our lives, things that cause us to struggle, things that we deal with, things that make us emotional, things that probably, I guess, deter us from following Jesus maybe as closely as we like. What are we supposed to do in those situations when we face those problems? How am I supposed to relate to God when I'm upset with Him, when I'm disappointed in God? And that almost seems bad to say. Am I allowed to be disappointed in God? I struggle with that myself. It's like I'm upset, I'm frustrated, I'm angry. What do I do when I feel like God isn't doing what I expect? What do I do when I'm upset with the way that God has chosen to handle things, or maybe He's allowed things to happen? How do I handle myself in those moments. And I think that we need to try, at least in some way, to answer some of those questions tonight, because maybe you have wondered after looking at all of the aftermath of something like that, or maybe even dealing with your own tragedy or own pain, you've asked a question like this. If you haven't, you probably will, or you're going to deal with somebody to do it. So I think that maybe it's good for us for a few minutes to try to answer those questions. And really, it boils down to two things, or one thing that has two facets. There's only one answer, or I guess there's two ways to answer this one question. How did God allow this? How would God allow it? There's a right way to answer the question, and there's a wrong way to answer the question. And the wrong way to answer the question is incredibly dangerous, which is why I want to highlight the Israelites and their struggles and their difficulties, and see in this particular occasion in Exodus 17 how they answered the question and it became dangerous. And I think in answering the questions, we'll also figure out something about God that all of us need to know, that all of us need to embrace and all of us need to trust. So let's look at Exodus tonight for just a few minutes. Exodus 17 is where I want to draw our attention. But leading up to that, we need to know how we got to chapter 17. And you can summarize it really quickly. Like, Exodus is all about the Israelites being in slavery from the Egyptians, or by the Egyptians. God set them free through miraculous plagues and the delivery of the Israelites from the Egyptians as they crossed over the Red Sea on dry ground when God parted it. That's basically Exodus 1 through 14 in a nutshell, that God delivered the Israelites from the hands of the Egyptians by miraculous plagues, by supernatural plagues that led them toward the Red Sea. He parted it, they crossed over. And now when you get to chapters 15, 16, and 17, they've begun their wilderness wanderings. And from the beginning of chapter 15, when they start into the wilderness, it's not without problem. In chapter 15, they lack good food. In chapter 16, they lack good water. Let me back up. Chapter 15, they lack good water. Chapter 16, they lack good food. Chapter 17, they lack good water again. Problems after problem after problem. And that not just limited to 15, 16, and 17, but throughout the remainder of the time that they wandered in the wilderness, there were all kinds of problems that they encountered. Israel is in trouble in Exodus 17. They're suffering. They have problems. There are tragedies that have arisen. That's where we find ourselves. Exodus 17. Israel is in trouble. Now, here's what we want to do, I guess, with our time tonight. There are three things to consider. I want us to look at the circumstances of Exodus 17, what's happening with Israel in our particular text that propels our thoughts toward this idea. I want to look at the root issue, or the root problem that Israel was dealing with, and then I want us to see the response from God, and we'll break it down just like this. When we look at the circumstances first, we'll notice that the Israelites had found themselves in the wilderness. Now, again, I guess, before we maybe break down some of those phrases or even pay close attention to the ones that are highlighted in red, I want you to see that this text falls in a greater scope of things. Like, what happens in Exodus 17 isn't an isolated event. It's not something that just happens one time in the life of the Israelites. It's not something that just happened kind of on a whim. This is in a series of experiences that the Israelites have as the wilderness wanderings progress, right? So chapter 15, they didn't have any water. Moses deals with the rock and they get water, and it was nasty and bitter. And then 16, they were hungry, so God gives them the manna. And chapter 17, kind of in the same situation, they don't have water. So it's not just an isolated event, but it comes right on the heels of two incredibly miraculous things. And those two incredibly miraculous things are the plagues, the fact that God exercised his power over the Egyptian gods and all of the false gods of the world by showing them that they could not match or withstand the power that he had and demonstrated over them. The second miracle was the Red Sea, and the fact that God did part the Red Sea so that 2 million Israelites would be freed from Egyptian bondage, so that they could walk over on dry land. And not just did they cross over on dry land, but then God swallowed the whole Egyptian army up in the Red Sea to be left there and covered up by the water of the Red Sea. That's incredible. That's what happened just before you get to the wilderness, where the Israelites are now in trouble. Here's the fact of the matter. The circumstances in Exodus 17 is that the children of Israel are in the wilderness. And the wilderness is hostile territory. They're in a dangerous situation. They're in an unpleasant and uncomfortable situation. The wilderness is hostile territory. We know in Exodus 15 and verse 22, when they were in that first water dilemma, that they had been 3 days across the Red Sea without any water. So we're talking about a difficult, uncomfortable situation that as you get to chapter 17, they had already journeyed 3 days without finding any water, and then they get some, and it just wasn't a pleasant experience. They're hungry in chapter 16. In chapter 17, now they're thirsty again. And we're talking about a miserable experience for the Israelites. No food, no water again. Problem after problem that the Israelites encounter in the wilderness. And the first question that I have when I read chapters 15, 16, and 17, God led them to the wilderness. We know that. God led them to the wilderness. And you see then they get to the wilderness and they have problem after problem after problem. And the question that I have in my mind is, why? And the answer is this: problems are what you run into when you're in the wilderness. The wilderness is a hard place. The wilderness is full of problems. The wilderness has all kinds of issues. It was a place where they met God, sure, but it was a difficult place. It was desolate, and it was barren, and it was hot, and it was nasty, and it was hard. It was uncomfortable. They had seen salvation. Yes, they had known the salvation of God and the miraculous ability of God, but just because they saw that didn't mean that it was happily ever after. The Israelites still had a journey to make. They had a spiritual journey to make, and they had a physical journey to make, and that spiritual and physical journey led them right through the wilderness. I want you to know tonight, the wilderness is supposed to be hard. It's supposed to be. It's supposed to have problems. It's supposed to have issues. It's supposed to have bumps in the road. It's supposed to have hindrances. It's supposed to have obstacles. The wilderness is a hard place. And so before we ever move into the results or the root issue or the response from God, you have to know that the Israelites in their circumstances, they were right where God wanted them to be. And we already know, too, from Exodus 15 in verse number 25, that the Lord had brought them to that place to test them. That's what he says to Moses in Exodus 15 and verse 25. And he'll say it again in Exodus 17, that the reason I brought you to this place, the place of difficulty, was for this purpose, because I want to test you here. He isn't tempting them. Don't misunderstand me. James says in James 1, 13 through 15, God can't do that. And he won't do that. He won't tempt us. That's not the issue. But what we learned this morning when we looked at the sparrows and God allowing the sparrows fall is that God will allow things to happen in our lives, difficulty to happen, to test our allegiance. It exposes what we trust in when we go through the wilderness. Do I trust in me? Do I trust in other things? Or do I really trust in God? I heard a man say one time that God will test or prove his servants in order to strengthen their faith, but God will never induce sin or destroy their faith. And I also don't want to be misunderstood when I say things like God put them in the wilderness, God allowed the difficulties in the wilderness. I don't know that we'll always know the exact reason behind the pain that we experience in the wilderness. I don't know that we'll always be able to pinpoint that. I haven't been able to in my life. I don't know if you have, but I don't know that we can do that. But I do know this, that whatever pain that we do experience in the wilderness, God can use it for good. And he would do that for the Israelites if they would just trust him. But what they did was expose to us and to everyone that their trust was somewhere other than God. And that was the purpose of the wilderness. It was hard. It was difficult to show where true allegiances lied. And Israel often failed the test. We talk about God using bad things for good. I didn't think about it this way until this afternoon. You know how sometimes, like when you get in an argument, guys, you don't have to admit that you do this with your wife, but maybe you get in an argument with your wife and then afterwards you think of what you should have said that would have really made, Have you ever done that? Just really would have got it. I mean, that would have ended the argument right there. Sometimes I do that when I preach too. Like I get home and I'm like, man, I should have said that. That would have been a good thing. I didn't think about that till I got home. And I was thinking about it this morning when we talked about God using painful situations, like the sparrow falling. God knew all about it. He willed it to happen, that hard thing to happen so that something good could come out of it. I was thinking about how God used the worst thing that ever happened in the course of humanity, or that would ever happen. Jesus dying on the cross, he used it for good, eternal good. God is the master at that. He specializes in taking painful situations, what happens in the wildernesses of our life, and using them for our benefit. That's the circumstance, okay? We need to know that before we move any further. The children of Israel were in the wilderness, and the wilderness is hard. It's supposed to be hard, which tells me as I journey toward heaven, toward the promised land, as I journey toward the promised land, and I'm trying my best to trust in trusting God, that the wilderness is intentional. It was planned to expose where my allegiance really lies. Is my life in the wilderness going to tell everybody that I trust God or I trust other things? That was the dilemma for Israel. They're in the wilderness, and the wilderness is hard. Now let's dig a little deeper and look at the problem. What was the root issue? Okay, now that they're in the wilderness and they couldn't help it, God led them there. It was intentional so that they could see what was happening. We're in the wilderness. It's a part of life. That's where we're supposed to be. But what was the root issue in Exodus chapter 17? Now let's dig into the text a little bit more. Verse 1, the Israelite community, the entire Israelite community left the wilderness of sin, moving from one place to another. That's not like literally the wilderness where they sinned. That's actual place, wilderness of sin, by the way. Moving from one place to the next, according to the Lord's command. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they complained to Moses, saying, "Give us water to drink." "Why are you complaining to me?" Moses said. "Why are you testing the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water and grumbled against Moses. And they said, "Why did you even bring us from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" Verse 4. Moses cries out to the Lord, "What should I do with these people? In a little while they'll stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take the staff you struck the Nile with in your hand and go, and I will stand there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. When you hit the rock, water will come out of it and the people will drink." Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. He named the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites complained and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Now, most of us would read the verses in Exodus 17, 1 through 7, and you would say, what is the problem? What is the root issue in Exodus 17, 1 through 7? And somebody might say, well, they don't have any water. That's an issue, but it's not the root issue. That's a big problem. It's a core issue, I might say, maybe an important thing, but I don't think it's the root issue. The root issue in Exodus 17, 1 through 7 is that the Israelites didn't trust the Lord. That was the root issue. That was why their circumstances were so miserable and why the circumstances that they were facing were amplified into these big issues because they didn't trust the Lord. I mean, think about what they had seen God do. Think about how many times you read in the Old Testament, God remind them of what they had seen him do. Like, you've seen me, I created the world from nothing. I flooded the whole earth and saved 8 souls. I literally helped you escape the most powerful nation on earth by exercising my power over them. I parted the Red Sea. Later on, they crossed over the Jordan on dry land, and God dammed the river up miles. I'm talking about 7 to 10 miles for 2 million Israelites to cross over on dry ground. Constantly, he would say, just remember what I'm doing. So after all that God had done, and they'd seen him do, the repetitive nature of those miracles and the fact that God would remind them over and over again what he's done, it just shows the absurdity of Israel's lack of trust. Like, what more did they need to see? Why is the issue of trusting God still an issue for Israel? I don't understand it. I don't understand it through the whole Old Testament. That's one thing that I struggle with as Israel. It's like, how could you not believe? How could you not see it after everything that you've seen? The root issue in Exodus 17 is not circumstances. It's not having water. It's not trusting God. And I think sometimes that's our issue too. I think sometimes the reason we struggle to deal with the wilderness times in our life is not whatever problem it is that's causing an issue in the wilderness time. It's the fact that we don't trust God to handle it, or that something good for us eternally would come out of it. How is this going to help me be a better Christian? We have sometimes a problem seeing that, just like the Israelites did. How do we respond? I want to point out to you that I think there's a critical distinction in Exodus 17 between complaining and accusing. And I think really that what you see in verse number 2, the people complain to Moses, "Give us water to drink. Why are you complaining to me? Why are you testing the Lord?" Some of your Bibles, you see that and you think, okay, well, complaining. I want to point out a distinction that I think the text goes on to make, and we're a little bit thrown off by the word complaining. Because when we think of complaining, it's like, oh man, I hate the building, it's so hot today. It's like, I've said that. I was sitting in my office and I was waiting on the shower to be over, or while that was going on, I was watching football and working on this PowerPoint, to be exact. So if you see any problems than I've just put it together this afternoon. But anyway, I was sitting in there working on this PowerPoint, and I felt the unit kick on, and it was felt like heat. It's like 90 degrees outside, and the heat feels like it's on. I was complaining about the heat, and that's what we think of. Like when we complain, it's just talking about our problems and being honest. That's what will mask it sometimes. I'm just being honest. I'm just telling you how I feel. And in some ways or another, that's not right. But there is a good way of complaining in the Bible. Do you know that? That there is a good way to complain in the Bible. In fact, I would argue that every major Bible character complained to God. You have a snapshot in every major Bible character's prayer life or conversations with God where they actually complain to God. Take Psalm 142, for example. Psalm 142 and verse 1. David said, I'm crying aloud to the Lord. I'm pleading above to the Lord for mercy. I pour out my complaint before him. I reveal my trouble to him. You see, it happened all the time in those major Bible characters where they, in a sense, contend with God by pouring out all of their problems to him. So when we talk about complaining, that's what we think. We think about pouring out our problems and talking about them and being honest with them. There's a negative spirit in which we can do that, but I also think the Bible talks about a positive way to complain, turning everything we have over to God. I thought about Jacob too. You remember how Jacob is known to have wrestled with God? And Jacob even walked away with a permanent hip injury because he took on God in a wrestling match. But I'll tell you this about Jacob. He was willing to give everything over to God and wrestle with him and walk away with a limp for the rest of his life than he was to not say anything to God at all. He was willing to pour it out to God and wrestle with him and give it to him. Yes, contend even. But he knew that he wasn't going to win. And he was willing to walk away with a limp for the rest of his life than he was to never say anything at all. What I'm trying to get to you is that when we see the word complaining in Exodus 17, there's something deeper than just what we think about complaining. Complaining is being honest, talking about the things that we have. We can do it in a negative spirit, but I think also there's a positive element to complaining when we complain to God and we pour out our feelings. In this respect, I guess the Bible kind of prefigures a modern psychology technique. You can't deny your feelings, so you might as well talk about them. That's what we're talking about when I say complain. Talk about your feelings to God. But in Exodus 17, in verse number 2, the word complain is more than that. It actually falls under the category of accusing. The word means something like to mitigate. It means something like to press charges against God or to press charges against Moses or to quarrel, some translations even say. It is this idea of being contentious, almost like you're putting Moses on trial. That's what the Israelites were doing. They were in the wilderness on trial before God, but in their minds, God was on trial and they were the judge. God, why did you do this to us? It wasn't just they were complaining about their feelings or telling God how they felt. They were literally accusing God. And there's a difference. I don't want us to miss that in Exodus 17 because that's a big deal. Sometimes when we're struggling with the wildernesses in our life, we do a little bit of both, maybe. Maybe we do complain and we tell God about how we feel. That's okay. Every major Bible character did it. Every one of them. They poured out their honesty to God, told him, this is what I'm struggling with. This is how I feel. That's okay. But we find ourselves in some major hot water and a major dangerous situation when we step across the line to saying, God, how could you? How could you do this, God? Why did you do this, God? How could you, this idea of putting God on trial for whatever he did or didn't do, that's where the Israelites went wrong. The aforementioned complaining, Israel's fine. If they're saying, God, this is how we feel, this is what we're struggling with, God would say, okay. But they went further than that and began to accuse him, and that's never okay. Israel had been given freedom. They had been guided by the pillar and the cloud. They have been delivered miraculously, or at least had their needs met miraculously. All of these things had happened, and they still had the audacity to ask in verse number 2 and 3, is God even with us, right? Is God even still among us? The charge that they accuse God with is, God must have abandoned us. That's how they felt. In their wilderness, they accused God, charged God of having abandoned. Now, it's one thing to complain to God, but it's a whole nother thing entirely to accuse him. And I I would be willing to say that most of us here have probably found ourselves treading on that water. Like when we're dealing with pain and we're dealing with tragedy, when we're just in the wilderness of life, how easy we can be walking this line of complaining and might even teeter on the other side of accusing, right? Of putting God on trial for what we think He did or didn't do. It is 1,000% acceptable in wilderness time to bring all of your cares to God. Yes, even the cares that frustrate you and even the cares that make you deeply angry. However, to come to God in a spirit of anger or complaint against Him, that's a problem. It's never proper to do that. That's where wrongdoing occurs. That was the root issue with Israel. So here's my advice to you. Be honest with God, sure. Don't hold anything back. Throw all your cares on it. Guess what? Not one of your bits and pieces of emotion scares or intimidates God. He can handle them all. He wants you to be honest with Him. He invites you to cast all your cares on Him because He cares for you. 1 Peter 5 and verse 7. In fact, that's the most humble thing you can do. I like that in 1 Peter 5. He says, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, and in due time you will be exalted. And sometimes we like to read 1 Peter 5 and verse 7 as its own little sentence with a capital C, casting all your cares on Him. But it's the same sentence. It's like Peter says, this is how you show your humility to God. You give Him everything. You want to show that you're a spiritually humble person, you give everything you have to God. Cast it on Him. He can handle it. It's totally acceptable to do that. But where we get in trouble is when we cross the line and we put God on trial. And I know this from experience. I'm not a very good judge. Neither was Israel. That was the root issue. So then let's look at the response, right? What happens? How does God handle it? This was the most eye-opening thing in the passage, in my opinion, and what excited me about this thought. Read Exodus 17 a million times. I've taught it for the last 5 years. Just now made the connection, and it really made me love the passage even more. Notice verse 6. Exodus 17:6. This is where God responds to the accusations of the Israelites. Notice what He says. I'm going to stand there, this is God speaking to Moses, in front of you on the rock at Horeb. I think the only major translation that differed was the NIV. I think the King James Version says, I will stand upon the rock. And every other translation, ESV, New American Standard, Christian Standard, everything I looked at says upon or on the rock. And I saw that wording, and I have this feature on one of my Bible softwares where you can compare all of the texts. And when you look at all of the versions of the Bible, it'll even tell you what percentage of the verse is different in each translation. 29% different, 45% different. And it'll highlight what's different. And it was amazing to me that out of all of them, only one was different. It was the NIV. And I thought that was pretty interesting that all of them had this phrase, stand on the rock. I think the NIV says standing by the rock, but everything else says stand on the rock. Now, I read that and I was thinking, what does that mean? And there were a couple of things that just jumped out to me. Number one, rather than calling the people to stand before God, rather than summoning everyone to come stand before Him, He says, I'll go stand before you. I like that about God, don't you? That God has always been one to give Himself to us, that He's always been the one to pursue us. I never thought about that either until Tim's devotional the other morning at the men's breakfast when he read Psalm 23, and I was actually reading it in one of the different versions on my phone, and instead of goodness and mercy will follow you all the days of your life, the Hebrew word kind of indicates the idea of a pursuit. Goodness and mercy will pursue you. And that made that even stronger to me, that God's just the kind of God that will come after us. And so when I see that God says, I'll stand before you on the rock. He could have said, hey, everyone come stand in front of me. He has all the right in the world to do that. But instead He said, hey, I'm going to go stand before you. I'll bring myself to you. That stood out to me. But then it says He stands on or stands upon the rock, which means that God is now identifying Himself with the rock, that He is attaching Himself to the rock. And then it says that Moses was to strike the rock, and from his strike or from his obeying God's orders to strike the rock, then the water would come and satisfy all of the people. And so what you have is this picture, I think, of judgment, really a picture of Jesus, and I'll prove it to you in just a second. But when God attaches Himself to the rock by standing on it, and judgment was put on the rock by its striking, God essentially shows a picture of the New Testament image of God himself bearing judgment that he didn't deserve. And by him bearing judgment he didn't deserve, everyone else drank of the water of life freely. Now put your finger in Exodus 17 and turn to 1 Corinthians 10. 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 6, where Paul is describing a situation to the church at Corinth where he does what often New Testament writers do, take the minds of the audience of people back to the issues and problems that the Israelites had in none other than the wilderness times. Now listen to this, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1 through 6. I don't want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and passed through the sea and were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. Pause. That's where we are, right? They've just come through the Red Sea. They've just been set free from slavery. They're following the guidance of the pillar and the cloud. Read on in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. They all ate the same spiritual food. They all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank, listen to this, from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, since they were struck down in the wilderness. Now these things took place as examples for us, so that we will not desire evil things as they did. I read that and I thought, wow, that's important, that verse. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with them. What happened? They drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. It's an image. It's a picture. It's an idea of what happens in Exodus 17. God identifies himself with the rock. He attaches himself to it. The rock is struck. It's an image of judgment. And then from that judgment, that exercising of wrath or judgment on that rock, man, from it flows all of this life that satisfied all of the ungrateful Israelites. All of the Israelites that didn't deserve it. All of the Israelites that were struggling with their trust in God. The water flowed freely to satisfy them anyway. Paul would tell the church at Corinth that was an image. You think back to that experience with your ancestors in the wilderness, that is a perfect depiction of what Jesus Christ has done for you. That he attaches himself, bears that identity. The wrath of God, the judgment was put on Jesus. And as a result of him bearing that wrath and bearing that judgment, from him flows the water that's able to cleanse our souls. I know it because on two occasions Jesus says it. The first in John 4, when he's talking to that woman at the well. You remember he tells her, I have water that if you drink this water, you'll never be thirsty again. That's the water that I have. And in Revelation 22 and verse 17, John records Jesus saying, the Spirit and the bride say, come. All who have ears to hear, let them come. Let any who is thirsty come and drink of the water of life. Now, I read Exodus 17 and I think about the experiences that the Israelite had in the wilderness, and that Jesus then fulfills this great image, this picture of being the rock of ages. We sang about him twice this morning. Hide me, O thou rock of ages. Rock of ages, cleft for me. Jesus is the rock who was struck for our sins so that the water of life would flow from him. When we suffer, we're quick to accuse God. We are. We walk that fine line of complaining and accusing, and sometimes we'll lean on the side of being honest. Maybe it just depends on the depth of the pain in the wilderness, but we lean towards him complaining sometimes. But most of the time we sort of fall on the other side of, man, God, why did, it's the accusing. That's wrong. That's never okay. It's not proper to do that. And that was the issue with the Israelites in Exodus 17. But God took the judgment on him anyway. And he gave water that satisfied the Israelites, and they didn't deserve it. That to me is an incredible picture of God. And yet God bears our judgment so that we can do the same today, that we can drink of the water of life freely. We can have the benefits of God's love and God's mercy, even if we don't deserve it. I shared this quote this morning with you at the end of the lesson. This is the way that I concluded our lesson, and I thought that it would be appropriate tonight, that there is no conceivable situation. There is no conceivable situation in which it is unsafe to trust God. Even in the biggest tragedy, even in the greatest pain, even in the biggest mess-ups There is no conceivable situation in which it's unsafe to trust God. The Israelites, they found themselves in the wilderness. You too, you're living right there. All of us tonight are living in the wilderness. And guess what? The wilderness is hard. It's supposed to be that way. That it's a process of refining. It's a process of being exposed to where your true allegiances lie. What do your experiences in the wilderness say about your allegiances tonight? What do people see when they look at you? What do they see that you love? What do they see that you trust? How do those experiences of tragedy and pain and difficulty, how do they influence you to lean? Is it that you'll pour your heart out before God? Let's do that. Let's be better at that. Let's help others see that accusing God and laying blame on God, putting God on trial, that's a dangerous path to walk. Instead, let's put our trust in what God's doing, often behind the scenes that we can't understand. And even if we do for a time, it's just a small part of what God is going on, what God's got going on. Let's trust in God. Let's trust in God. Let's put our whole heart behind God and His purposes and watch what He does and how He works in the wilderness. What came after the wilderness for that next generation of Israelites? The Promised Land. Promised Land. Those who successfully navigated the struggles of the wilderness, well, actually a whole generation missed out on it because they didn't. They trusted in something else other than God. Let that not be said of you on that great. Don't miss out on the Promised Land because you let the wilderness win. Trust God. If we can help you tonight in any way, we beg you to.